Hello all, and welcome to another edition of the Low Code Cafe. This is episode 129 for Wednesday, March 1st, 2023. Today we're going to continue building out our low code application. We're going to continue on with adding line items to our invoice, and then perhaps go on to doing some logic to actually generate the invoice. But we'll continue from where we left off the last time.
Dale, sorry to interrupt you. I just want to point out you're not sharing screen.
Thank you very much. See, this is why it takes a village. Forgive me, I'm just going to start over. Hello all, and welcome to another edition of the Low Code Cafe, episode number 129 for Wednesday, March 1st, 2023. Today we're going to continue building out our low code application. This is part 4, where we're going to take where we left off. We were building an invoice, and now we're going to add line items to the invoice. So we'll do that and perhaps more today. But before we get into that, let me introduce myself. I'm Dale Warner, Head of Support for Plantain App. We have with us today Patrick Anderson, who is our Technical Success Manager for Plantain App and very capable at keeping me on track. This is an event we do every Wednesday at this hour, where we get together, talk about low code, and do demos and update you on what's going on with the product. But the biggest part of it is typically in hands-on low coding. So we invite you, if you have some low code application in Plantain App, we'd be happy to host you and give you a chance to demonstrate and show off what you've done to our community. We have several of those lined up in the weeks to come. At least that's the plan. That's what we're working on. So do stay tuned for that. All of these episodes are recorded and put out on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/plantainapp. So we invite you to go out, subscribe, click the alarm bell so that you get notified when we post new episodes. Today, we'll be doing a brief from the trenches segment, talking about the things that we see in support, and then we'll get right on with hands-on low-code development. Do engage with us, though. There's a chat window. You can ask questions in the Q&A window, or raise your hand and ask us a question. After it's all over with, there's a feedback form. Do use that to give us feedback on what you saw, what you'd like to see. So in the trenches of support, oftentimes we have hotfixes to release. We have no new hotfixes for version 124 today. So we stand at 15 released hotfixes, and we are in the process of closing out our 1.25 release, and we'll be talking more about what features will be part of that in an upcoming episode. Today I wanted to talk a couple of things that are going on with tokens and core tokens, and this was just questions that came up on the community, and it kind of raises the issue of what's available within our product. So first I want to talk about core tokens, that the usage of these core tokens are documented inside the product. There's when you browse along in the product, you can learn something about what the syntax is for the token, and so we'll take two today that we're going to look at. One is the user token, and that has a couple of different forms that it can take, and another is HasRole. So I'm going to jump over into a Plantain App application and go into tokens. Core tokens, I've got a lot of other tokens that I've added, but core tokens ships with the product and typically appears at the top of the list. And so it would have things like there's host and portal, and you can get a whole lot of information and store a lot of information through using these tokens. Lots and lots of functionality in here. I'm going to point out two of them. So there's a user token, and HasRole is where we're going to start. So let's see if I can find user on the list. There's also a shortcut. There it is. It's all the way at the top. But you can also come up to the top and filter by name and type user and get to them that way. But the user token here shows the values that you can get out of it, how to use it, and perhaps some examples. And so then there's a test area at the bottom where you can use the tokens. So for example, we can use the user token to get the user's first name. And so the user token begins with the namespace of user, put a colon and first name, and close it out, and it will tell you the user's first name. Now, in my case, I'm logged in as a user that doesn't have a first name set, so I'm going to change and say that instead I want the username. The username is listed as one of the fields that you can get out of the user token. So when I use the run button, it shows me my username. The user token has a special characteristic where you can pass it in a user ID that you want to retrieve the username for, or any of the other properties for. So you can say in parentheses, user ID equals 2, whatever user ID you give it, that's the value that it's going to return. So the username for user ID is this email address. If I change this to, for example, first name, just hope this works. Nope, there wasn't a first name set up for that one either. Let's go for the email characteristic. I'm sure that'll be there, which is the email happens to be the same as the username. Anyway, just pointing out that user has this extended functionality, and it's documented here within the core token where you can pass in a user ID. The question came up on the community forum. That's community.plantonapp.com about the HasRole core token. So HasRole is just, its definition is slightly simpler. It just says it's going to return back a true or false whether or not the current user has a given role. So you can do something like HasRole manager, and it will tell me whether or not I, the current logged in, am in that role. And currently I don't. I think it's managers. Let's see. Yeah, that's better. You got to give it the right name or the number of a role, and you can see the roles in the roles tab. So this is telling me I have the manager's role, and this is kind of a useful functionality if you want to condition a button or a display or virtually anything in the low code. If you want to condition it and only show it if somebody is in a particular role, then HasRole is very useful. But one of the reasons, so that's tokens in a nutshell, but I also wanted to tell you that that functionality that we're looking at, where the construct was where you could pass in a user ID for the user token, that's not universal. You can't pass it into HasRole. And so you have to look carefully at the way that a token is documented and use it in the way that it's specified. And then it will give you what you ask. So that's about core tokens. That's kind of a no code 101 topic, but there's also let's see, another topic here about tokens, and I'm just going to jump into known issues. So this is for people who are upgrading systems. If you're installing PlantonApp for the first time, you're not going to run into this because we don't allow this. But in older versions, we allowed token namespaces to start with things other than these rules, like starting with a number. So the token namespaces now, we enforce that they must start with a letter and contain only alphanumeric characters. And it appears we've allowed them to start with numbers in very old versions of my tokens. And if you have that circumstance, if you're an upgrader, then you're going to have to remove and change your token namespace to conform to the new namespaces, or you'll have issues within your system. So something that doesn't impact a lot of people, but will impact some. So the namespace that I speak of when you go to create a token, Now this is creating a token. I want to create a namespace. So that's new namespace. That's what I'm talking about. So this is, somebody might have had a namespace like one ABC in the past, and we would have allowed it. But we don't allow it. And so the namespaces must begin with letters and can have numbers in them, and they can't have spaces in them. So that's just a rule for naming them, so they remain consistent and that you don't run into processing problems. So not a common issue, but one that we wanted to note. Aside from that, we want to encourage you to join us for our other weekly session on Fridays. On the same hour, we do the low code campfire. That's more of a discussion format where you can bring questions and assist your fellow Plantain app users. So very useful session that happens once a week. That's more of a meeting format. Patrick, I will ask you to please post the links for this episode. This is where you can sign up for the low code campfire, where you can find our recordings, access our community portal, give us feedback. And then today, depending on how far we get, I might be talking about a concept called level break logic. And so I found a good article or a good demonstration out on the web of this, if you hadn't ever seen it before. So that'll be available for you if you want to use it. Good. So now on to hands-on low coding. And we're going to start by talking about building invoice line items. So just a quick recap of the problem that we're doing. We're building a fitness center application. And in episode 126, we talked about the business problem and did some analysis and planning. In episode 127, we got down to business and started building out the data structure. Last time in episode 128, we created some basic building blocks for doing invoicing, a workflow that creates an invoice and another workflow that adds line items to the invoice. Very generic logic and isn't tied to any particular thing like a fitness center, but just how to do invoicing, or one way to do invoicing, and keep it very simple. So we'll continue on today to actually use that functionality that we built to generate invoices for the client. That's the plan. Just, I guess, let's see. We have some. Nope, that was from last time. By way of review of what we've done in our last episode, we built those building blocks. So one to create one workflow to create an invoice, one workflow to add line items to an invoice, and then we created another one to generate a PDF. And I thought I'd review that because I've made a few changes offline, so you didn't have to sit and watch me work. And so I've done a little bit of cleanup on that, and we can do a little bit of final cleanup and then move on. But our goals today will be to include invoices that will have line items in them, and then if we have time, we'll go on to generating invoices. So here we go. Let's do that review. This anymore, so we get into our fitness application. And we're going to look at workflows. We had a workflow to create an invoice, and so this accepted things like who the person that was selling it was and who the customer was. It creates an invoice for them, and then we had an add item to invoice. It accepted values like what invoice are we adding to, and then generic fields like title, description, quantity, and unit price. And we calculated a final price from that inside that workflow. In the generate invoice PDF, and let's see this work. I'm going to run it, and we'll give it an invoice ID of 2. The output from this is a PDF, and we have a PDF URL. So I'm going to open this URL and see what our invoice looks like. I've cleaned this up a little bit from the last time. So we're showing an invoice number instead of a quote number, where I filled in the who the invoice is to, who the invoice is from, and but we don't, if we get down here into the description, we don't have line items, and then we have the total. So this is the area that we're going to work in today. We're going to fill this in. But as I said, I did a little bit of work, and I wanted to show you the work that I did. So in our generate invoice workflow, as I edit it, the input to this is that we're providing an invoice number, an invoice ID number, and that gets us all the fields for an invoice. Our main logic is that we're reading a bunch of things. We're gathering the information we need to generate the invoice. So the first one is that we're getting reading our person entity using the customer that we want. So we're taking the invoice customer to get a output token called customer. So that's going to be all the fields having to do with the customer. We didn't do this last time, but I realized that we needed it, so I added it. We're using the customer's location to read the location record. And so that's going to give us a location entity, and that gives us all the fields like the name of the location and the address of the location. We had this one the last time. It was, we take the invoice who sold it, and we get a sold by token output. So that is going to be the salesperson that was involved. And then the last thing that we had before was a generate PDF action. So the generate PDF action, we fed it some HTML, and it created an output that that we could use and send out to our to whoever calls this workflow. I've simplified it to instead of having all of my HTML right inside this action, I've simplified it, or simplified it for me, in that I've used a create or update token to split our HTML up into a template header, which is all the meta styling kinds of information, and then a separate one that's just the HTML. And I did this because it makes it a little bit easier to maintain. And then this is purely documentation. I have a HTML editor reminder. This is a nice HTML editor that I use sometimes, htmltidy.net. And we're going to use that to continue to work with this HTML. So the idea here is that this is not interactive, and I like to use, I happen to like to use, this is a preference thing, an HTML editor that lets me switch back and forth between working with HTML and working with it visually. So what we see here is I've pasted this HTML in, and now we see kind of what it looks like. And so we can see there's table structure and things like that. And so the cleanup that I did was in the area of the to and the from. I used our customer entity, the customer return value from the read. So customer salutation, first name, infix, last name, all present there. And then I used information out of the location table that I've added to it, so we can get the company name and the number and the address and things like that all out of the location. And then we use sold by down here to say if this if somebody is sending a mail back to this is the name of the person that who is sending the invoice, the salesperson. So it's kind of nice to have this ability to work in both views, the interactive view and the HTML as well. And so just the sales representative, I'm going to fill this in and we'll be done with this. So we're going to put in the sold by first name, last name, which I got up here, And then we can also fill in the sold by email. And again, this is a field that comes from our application. If we look in the, it's a person entity, and we have the email field as part of the entity. So we've read sold by as a person, and we can access any of these fields. And I did want to add the email to it, so I'm going to do that. So as I was making changes over here, this HTML updates, and so we can see now, oops, sorry for jumping around there. We can see now that the HTML has been modified, so we can copy that HTML back into our template. This tool happens to offer some nice indenting, so if you want to read your HTML, you can see it. It also offers compression, so you can remove all that and have it just be as efficient as possible. Doesn't matter which one we pick. I'm going to copy the compressed version and put it back into our move our template and fill it in with all of that information and save. So now the generate invoice works with the template header and the template that we just created. And so if we save and test this, give it an invoice of 2, we're going to get a new PDF. And when I load that, we're going to see now the name and email address shows up down in the sales representative. So that's just kind of a quick how to interactively work with the template and fill in more information. So that was the cleanup effort that I did. Patrick, was any part of that clear?
Yeah, absolutely. I like the process of putting your template into the tokens and kind of separating it out for ease of use.
Yeah, and that was just a good point. When we separated these out, this this editor that I happen to use, this HTML tidy editor, didn't like all this meta stuff, and it's really intended to just edit the pure HTML stuff. So it was stripping it out anyway. So that wasn't this was kind of reacting to the circumstance that I found, and just so I'd split this preparation information off into its own thing. And so then there's the template. Good. All right, so to kind of go on, the idea here is that we have an input of an invoice, and we're going to want to go get the invoice items and add it to the invoice. But we're going to need to build something that fits in here instead of it being, this is left over from where this template came from. But instead of saying description, whatever, we're going to say this is that we're going to drop a token in here that is a table of all of our line items for this invoice. So that's what we need to build, a table for the line items. And there's lots of different ways to do it, but I'm choosing today to do it as a workflow to just generate invoices, to generate that those line items. And so the idea is that we'll have an input that is the invoice, and then we'll go out and get the information. So let's take a look at that. We just to kind of take a look at the data, and there's a couple of, we could do this interactively. I'm choosing to do it by SQL, but we have we have one row. This is our target invoice. It's got an ID. It's got things like when it was created and who the customer is. And then we have these invoice line items. And so what we're going to want to do when we're generating an invoice for line item for ID number 2, we're going to want to get all the invoice line items. But we've got to get the data somehow, and I'm going to do it by select. So it's going to look something like this. Select from invoice line item and have some test data here. We need to filter it down. We need to filter it to only do for the invoice that we care about. So we're invoice equals 2. In this case, there's only the test data. There aren't a bunch of invoices, but we only want the one for our client. So we're invoice equals 2. So this gives us all that we need. But there's extra information that we don't need. And so I'm going to clean this up a little bit. We want the title, we want the description, quantity, total. All the rest is not necessary for what we're doing. So this even starts to take the look of this data that we're looking at, starts to help you visualize what our items section is going to be like. It's got a title, description, quantity, price. So we'll start here. So the idea is we have to build, as we get into this, we're going to have to build a table structure in HTML that is going to include this kind of information. And if you know HTML, it's not too hard to do, but I'm going to demonstrate doing it interactively with this tool. So we can start from a blank slate, and we're going to create a table that has 1 row and 5 columns. And so you can see it's popped the HTML for us. So we didn't have to know HTML in order to be able to get this table. And the way that this works, it's kind of small to type in. So I'm going to just alternate back and forth between these. But I'm going to do the title, the description, the quantity, price, and item total. So the idea here is that this is a nice table structure for that we can start with, at least for using for generating that table. And the rows that I put in will be the header row, but then we're going to want more rows underneath it. But at least this will give us kind of the starting structure of what we need. So we've got some HTML to work with, and we'll grab that in a minute. All right, so let's see how this is going to work. We're going to need a new workflow. The workflow, so we'll do new, and this is we're going to keep it in our invoice namespace, so it's easy to find. And we're going to give it a name, and this is going to be something like bill 9 item table. So we'll do a little documentation like that. So the input is going to be an invoice. And that is something of a type, it's an entity of type invoice. So all the fields are going to come in with it when we do an invoice. The output we want to do is going to be a result or a table. I'm just going to call it a result. It doesn't really matter what we call it, as long as it's clear. And so at some point what we're going to pass back is the HTML, the actual table HTML, but we don't know what that is yet. And so we'll define that before we're done. So that's the inputs and the outputs. How are we going to get there? Well, the first thing that we're going to do, and maybe this will be the first test that we can do and kind of show how this process can evolve, one way to test it. We can use a context. We can create and update a token to initialize results. So we'll create a results token and take this table that we had and just put it right as the value. So results is just going to have the static information that is all the column headers, but no rows. And we'll save that and end. And so if we wire this to, we add the result token as the result variable, we can save and test this and see that really doesn't matter what invoice we pass it at this point, because we're not doing anything dynamic, but we can see that we're getting a table out. And in fact, we can already use this much. I'm going to go back to our generate invoice, and we can already wire the table into our template. If we were to, before we build our templates, if we were to insert some space here and run that workflow, this is going to be in our, what is it? We're going to execute the build line item table workflow. We can pass it an invoice, so invoice B, and we're going to get a result, which is going to be the line item table. So far, remember, this is just a static thing, but we have our line item table. If we go back into our template and find the place in our HTML, oh, it's too complex to find, but we can go and edit it in HTML tidy. And interactively, instead of doing this, let's just put it here. We have the line item table that came out. So that token that we created by the sub workflow is now just going to be inserted into this description. We can clean this up. It's cosmetic after that, but whether or not we want it to say description, but our line item table is just going to be pushed in there. So long as we return a good table, we should be good to go. So now we replace all of our template here with that revised one that has the template. And so if we now save and test this and pass it an invoice number, let's see if it gets that far. So now we see that that header, that just whatever's coming out of that build line item workflow is showing up here in the right place. So long as we give a good answer, now we've already wired it into our create invoice. So now we just need to clean it up, and kind of an iterative process where we're doing it, and now we're going to do it. We're going to improve it to do it right. So build line item table, we'll edit that and improve it. So instead of just returning a static table with nothing in it, we're going to improve this to do more things, to actually go get the line items. So we'll make ourselves some space to do some work, and let's see what we're going to do. First of all, this and this just kind of assumes you know a little bit of HTML here, but this is going to become a repeating pattern. This there are going to be more and more rows that get inserted at the spot after this. So rather than doing the whole table, I'm going to take this off for now, and we're going to initialize it with our headers. Our logic is going to add more rows to it below, and then at the very end we'll add the final piece of it. And so I guess while it's on my mind, I'll just go ahead and write that action. So in our create update tokens, we're going to modify the result to be the value of the result as it is, plus those two things that we just cut away. So these two things taken together, this is to initialize the table. This is to finalize result. And so now we just need to add some space in here to do the things in the middle. We're going to add the rows. So what does that look like? Well, we need to get the line items. And that's that SQL we were working on a little while ago. This go get the line items. And so we're going to do a run SQL action. Actually, create a list from SQL. And we'll get into this in a minute, but there's a reason I'm doing this with SQL. There's also, you could use our read all from an entity action. So read all from line items, but I want to do some SQL because we're going to do some fancy formatting here in a little while. So this leads us down that path. So this is going to be get the line items for the invoice. And so instead of doing it for a particular invoice like 2, we're going to do at invoice, which is providing a variable, and we're going to bind to that the invoice that we want. So we're binding this here, and the value we're going to get is our input invoice ID. So invoice 2 is going to get put in there. The output of this thing is going to be called the line items. So this is going to give us a list of things. There might be none, there might be 1, there might be 50, but we're going to have a list of line items that we can iterate through. And so that's exactly what we'll do next. There is an action called execute actions for each list entry. And that lets us loop through those easily. And so we're going to say process each item. The list that we're going through is the line items list. And what we're going to do inside for every entry in the list, we want to add that to the result. We're going to add a row to the result. Now I'm going to cheat a little bit, and we know that a row looks something like this, where it begins with a TR, and then we have TDs for all of our different things, and then a closing TR. So I'm going to copy that format because it's going to help me with a little bit of typing here. So as we're doing the processing each line item, we're going to, for each line item, we are going to create or update a token. And so we're going to be adding to the result. The result, the output is going to be result. We're going to be adding to, starting with whatever the result is so far. This is why we had to not have that ending table thing at the end. And then what we want to add to it is something in that same structure, but we don't want to add the words. We want to add the tokens. And so the tokens are going to look something like, they have a namespace of line items, and then we have the different values. So it's going to be line items title. Copy that just to save some time, and close the bracket. And then this field name is actually called item total. So it's price. We'll close out all of our. Hopefully I've done it somewhere close to correct. So when this gets evaluated, it's going to pull the value from the current row, line items, title, description, and put them all in the same place. And so this kind of gives us our structure automatically. And it tags it, adds it on to result. And this one line gets executed once for each row that was returned. So in this case, there's going to be 2 rows. It'll add 2 rows to the end. So we'll save that. And then we have our finalize, the result thing here. And we'll clean this up visually here a little bit. But the finalize, after all the rows have been added, We're going to take result and add on that body in that table, and it gives us a nice result. So we'll save that. We can test this interactively just to see what it's going to look like. So we'll pass it a 2, and we can see we have a body, and actually we can copy and paste this into our interactive editor just to see what it looks like. So membership fee, we can see that we're getting formatting of our quantities with 4 decimal places. So that's interesting. Unit price, item total. So, but it looks kind of nice. There are some, let's see, on our table. Let's see if we have interactively sell properties. I'm going to try with 100. No, that's not going to work. I just have, so here's got to know a little bit of HTML. Sure, there's a way to do this interactively, but I'm going to say width equals 100%, and that's going to take up all of the space. We could spend some more effort either with CSS or with using a table structure to maybe justify these things or center them, bold them, color them, whatever you want to do. But I'm going to stop there. So this gives us our, we're seeing that the table looks the way we want it to. Anyway, I'm going to go back and put this width parameter in our workflow, the initialize, to so that the table does what we want. So we'll save that. And I think it's worth now just kind of testing to see that we hit the target. So we go back to generate invoice, we run the thing, we do it for our same invoice. Grab the URL. Good so far?
Looking good.
All right. So what I mentioned earlier, I don't really like this formatting. The 4 digits after the decimal place, I really want to format it differently. And so now that we've got it working, we can do that with some SQL. So let's find that SQL. Let's start with quantity. Now, it's kind of interesting. We see it differently as we're doing the query interactively. We're not getting all the decimal points, but it's really depending on how you query the database, whether or not it's going to show you all the zeros or not. And so I'm going to start with quantity and just work with that. And I'm going to isolate it on a line here so we can see it work. So we have quantity, and there's a function that you can use that is called, instead of saying it this way, we'll say we're going to use the format function. We're going to get the format of the quantity, and we're going to happen to use the N format, and we're going to pass it a country code, a culture code, and then we're going to call this same variable name. Don't have too many commas here. So this formatting, when we run it, now applies the N formatting. You'll have to look up format. I apologize, I didn't have the link up here. But there's a number of different formatting options that you can apply to use culture code to give you an answer. And but this is one way to do it, and then the one of the fun pieces of this is that this sets you up, and going back to our original requirements from TCOE, the location of the culture code, the location of the item. Thank you for finding and pasting that, Patrick. Those format things are now on the clipboard on the chat. You can pass in other values like DEDE, and instead of processing it with a, that's kind of hard to see, but there's a comma there now instead of a decimal point. So in that culture code, numbers are formatted differently, and it's going to format it differently. So this is setting us up that we can pass in a culture code and get a different result depending on the location of the fitness center. So I'm going to crawl before I walk. I'm just going to hard code this for all of our different things. Whoops. So copy and paste. And so instead of the quantity, we'll apply the same logic to unit price. And we'll apply the same logic to item total. Here. And so now we see that these come out in a very specific format. So these are our new lines. And so if we go to our workflow, where we're building the line item table, where we used SQL to get the line items for the invoice, instead of doing these three things, we'll do this. So we're returning the same values, but we're formatting them. And so now when we save that and run our invoice, let's see, generate invoice 2. We're now getting it formatted in the item in the culture. So we've done that in a static way, and so now I think it's probably worth. We can finish off today by doing this in a by actually passing a culture code. So that won't take much effort. Let's start at the top. If we look at our entities and look at the location entity, our default location has a bunch of things, but we didn't say, we have a thing called currency, which was kind of where we were thinking we were going in the first place. But I'm going to add a new category, a new property to our location that will be culture code. Here, and I'm not going to, I'll just let them type it in as text and not worry too much about any of the other properties. We'll just get it onto the record just so we can use it. So now when we edit, we have culture code, and so we can put a culture code in the US. Save. So the location now has the culture code that we can, we're showing, I guess this is a quick review of how to retrofit an application, right? So location now has culture code. When we look at our workflows, and we start with generate an invoice PDF. And I guess maybe I'm starting at the wrong end. We'll get there, but we're reading the location so we can for the customer. So we here in our process, we're going to know, and we would be able to pass what the culture code is, but we need to pass it to the build line item table. So we're going to have to change that import the inputs to that first. So build line item table, let's make that change. So we're going to add a culture code as an input. These can't have spaces in them, so but that's just going to be a text field. for testing purposes, we could pass in a value, or we're past that point, so we're not going to worry about testing at the moment. So now we have a thing called a token called culture code, which we can, in our processing, when we do the SQL query, instead of saying ENUS, we can pass in a culture code that has the value of the input culture code. So we can use this as a variable now. We'll just insert this into our SQL. The culture code comes in as input, it's passed into the SQL, and so these things are going to get formatted according to where that comes from, and the output is just coming out as a table, so all good. So we're saving that, and without testing, I'm just going to go back to our generate invoice, and now when we look at when we go out and get our line item table, when we execute it, we now have a culture code that we can pass in, and we're going to pass in the location culture code. So we're going to get different formatting based on culture code. All right, so let's test this, see if we're right. So currently the locations culture code is set to English, US. And so if we go to do invoice 2, and get an invoice out of it, it comes in US. If we just make one change and say that the location is actually working in a different culture code, invoice again, we get them with commas, and if the numbers were bigger, we'd see bigger multiplication, right? We'd see separators that were periods instead of commas. So cool. All right, so we hit our first goal. Any questions on any of that? It's kind of a good stopping spot, Paul. Do you have anything I should go over a little bit more in depth, Patrick? If not, we will.
I don't think so. No.
Good. So we did our first thing. We included invoices, line items in the invoice. And then our next thing is generating invoices according to subscription. So that's probably, I guess what we'll do in the next just couple of minutes is a building block. When we generated our entities so far, we got a lot of things done, but we didn't actually build the subscription entity. So going back to our database model, we have everything except this, and we can build this today. So we have a location, we have offerings and subscription periods, and users who can buy. We haven't implemented this yet. We have people who can buy things, and so the idea is that the subscription is going to have many things. One, for if a person buys something, it's going to have an ID of a person, but it's also going to have an ID of whatever it is that they bought. And then that purchase will have a start date and an end date because it is a subscription. We also thought we might have a note on whether or not it's active, and then when the next invoicing is due. So this is the entity we need to build. And I think I have that here. And once we have that set up, it's going to support this kind of a definition. A subscription is what people have agreed to purchase. A person can have multiple subscriptions, and those may come due, get invoiced on the same or different dates. So I could have a basic membership to the cafe that I perhaps, excuse me, to the fitness center that I perhaps never use. And then Patrick might be far more active and have a basic membership and a diet plan and access to the pool that he goes all the time. So we're going to build an entity that supports that. So the entity looks something like this. Person offering. Up there on my other screen so I can build it, but it's going to have these attributes. So let's build that. We can do that in 5 minutes. So this is a new entity. It's going to be it's not in a particular namespace. It's going to be hide all these away in the back office maintenance for now. We don't really have any reason to display them. And it's going to have properties like person, which is a type person. We have an offering that was purchased. And this is an entity of type subscription offering. And then the offering already has a period associated with it. It's a 30-day or an annual or whatever. So that's where we're going to get that information. We have a start date, which is a date. Date, which is also a date. Note, which is just going to be a large text. Quite know what we're going to use it for, but we'll keep it. Whether or not the particular item is active for invoicing. That is a Boolean property. And so it's either is or is not. And then the next invoice date, which we will also say is a date. From a permissions standpoint, personal trainers will be able to view this, I guess, and users will be able to view it also, but we're not going to give any permissions to change it. It'll be left to the managers to add and delete and things like that. So basic handling of permissions, and then it wouldn't let me save because I hadn't selected a property that serves as the display name, and so I'll just pick one. It doesn't really matter. So we will pick the start date as the display property. So this gives us enough to enter in some sample data, and then we can finish off. So if we look at our subscription, and we wanted to say that we can do a new subscription, and this can be me, and I'm doing the basic membership. It starts today, and it doesn't have an end date, and is active, and doesn't have a next invoice date. So that represents that I have a basic subscription, and then we could do Patrick also has a basic subscription starting today. It's active, but Patrick also has a diet plan starting today. Obviously, we would want a nice interface rather than having to do this kind of selection, but this is the proof of concept kinds of things that you can do it interactively in the database and then work out how to have a nice entry. So this supports then having different things for different people. When we resume the next time, we will actually finally get to building invoices based on this start date. We've got all the pieces in place, so it shouldn't be very hard. Thank you for attending today, and we'll just say happy local coding, and we will see you next time. Patrick, thanks for your help.
Thank you, Neil.